Hi guys, welcome back to N Adders. Wanted to continue with the videos that we've been doing. We did the humidity yesterday and want to reaffirm my commitment to trying to keep this channel active and hopefully cover things that beginners will find useful. I did start this video once already and then got disturbed, so I'm going to try again. That's usually the way that these videos work. I forgot how much of an enjoyable experience it was trying to do this in a shop full of animals that make noise, racket and everything else. So fingers crossed we don't get disturbed again. Today I wanted to cover basic understanding of thermostats. I wanted to cover the different types of thermostats, a little bit of myth busting, and then how I would set a stat up pro positioning using a thermometer to help me out and explaining a little about why I do what I do. That isn't to say that the way I do it is the only way to do it, and people have found their own novel ways, and if it works for you, it works for you, and that's cool. But for those that are confused or don't quite grasp it, maybe me explaining my way of doing it will help you. And the whole idea of these videos is to help beginners, not confuse you, not make it worse, and try not to overcomplicate things and try and boil things down to essence rather than lots of complicated theory. So I already started, but we'll try again. So the three types of thermostat that are commonly available on the market: a mat stat or on-off stat, a pulse stat or pulse proportional thermostat, and a dimmer thermostat. These all have different actions on the heater, and that's based on the circuitry within the thermostat. On a mat stat, the circuit is either disengaged or engaged, disengaged or engaged. What that means is that we're going to end up with a wave of temperatures. And whilst we may offer a median recommendation temperature, say 30 degrees, what we've got to accept is, because it's always in a state of flux, that we may overshoot or undershoot slightly as it's trying to get to 30. So we might hit 32, we might drop to 28. Bloody fly, are you kidding me? Again, unbelievable. So 32 to 28, and we're never going to quite hit the 30 as much as we try. The pulse proportional thermostat can vary both how hard a pulse it gives and the duration of the pulse that it gives to try and hit its 30-degree value. So these cannot be used with light emitting heat sources. So only non-light emitting heaters can be used. If you were using either of these with a bulb on, in the case of a mat stat, it'd be on and off, on and off. And if it was a pulse, you'd get flickers of varying lengths as it tries to control the temperature. Not only would that act as a stressor on the animal, it would also more than likely burn the element out in short order because it's having to react too quickly. A dimmer thermostat, meanwhile, is permanently assessing and makes its small adjustments as necessary. This leads to a more even light experience for the animal within the enclosure, and that's why we use that for light emitting heat sources. Now, probably the most common myth I hear is, if someone's using a ceramic bulb, but I've only got a dimmer, I haven't got a pulse. It's fine. A dimmer is a universal heat controller. So do not worry that you have to have a pulse on a ceramic. You do not. You can use a dimmer on a ceramic, and the dimmer will be more accurate with the ceramic as well. So dimmers are universal. If you can afford a dimmer, buy a dimmer. It does the best job available. And yeah, I don't think that you'll run into any issues there. So yeah, that seems to be a really popular one. And then we also, as a final stage, have day-night units. And this is usually because we've got a digital clock running on the thermostat, and we will make arbitrary day-night changes. So say we run at 32 during the day, it might drop to 25 at night, and then it'll go back up to 32, and that'll be based on the set time parameters that you've got for day and night. But what we will need to look at is spikes and initial setup of thermostats. So as you can see, I've just drawn a rough outline of a vivarium here, and we're going to start placing equipment in there. You'll have to forgive my drawing skills, it's not easy doing it like I'm writing on a blackboard. So for example, we're going to mount, I'll do this, I mean more than likely you're going to use one of these brackets, but for ease of drawing, I'm just going to draw a batten fitting as we used to have, and say we're going to put our spot lamp in there. When you look at bulbs, they'll come with a rating R80 or R63, and that tends to be the angle of beam that comes out of the bulb. And this means that it's centered down. So you'll look at your spotlights and they will be mirror backed, and it forces the heat down. So the hottest point in the tank, in theory, is directly beneath the bulb. And we would make sure that we have a cave sat as a basking site for our animal to be able to rest on. So this is king. This is the basking site. So if we draw a little crown. Now, if I was to put the probe for the thermostat on the basking site, what happens if a lot of us keep heavy-bodied animals, monitors, tegus, big boas, big pythons. They have a lot of mass, they cover the sensor, the thermostat isn't receiving the signal from the bulb, so it knows what the temperature is, thinks potentially the temperature's gone down, and it increases the heat. So it actually increases burn risk. So we need to measure this, but we're not going to have the thermostat probe there. This is my version, remember, other people will do it different ways. So what we'd potentially do, and it would just be for the setup period or for when you're doing your periodic checks, you would have your digital thermometer. Some people use guns. They can worry me slightly because that's a reflected surface temperature. We'll go into that in a minute. So I would use a digital thermometer, and the probe would come through, and the sensor would be at rest where the king icon is, the crown is, and this is going to give us our reading. So for the sake of argument, we're going to say that we're setting up a corn snake in a 4-foot vivarium. So we want the basking area to be 30 degrees at the thermometer sensor. So where do I put my thermostat probe? Well, I need it to be in a place where it's not allowed to be moved or dragged, which is the other issue with having it loose in the tank or on a hide where an animal can shift it, because then it gives a reading that the temperature's changed, and again either turns the heat up or down depending on whether the animals move the sensor closer or further from the bulb. So generally they will come down the back wall, usually through a notch cut in a vent, and they'll stop about 6 inches off the floor, and they will be secured in place so it cannot be dragged. And it means then that we know that that stat is in a permanent position. And now this, we will reference this as the king, such as in chess. Checkmate, you capture the king, but the king is useless. He can only move 1 square at a time. He's effectively crap. Whereas the queen controls everything. And that goes, that sensor, to our thermostat box. I'm just going to draw a rudimentary thermostat box. There's a lot of digital units out there now, but accept that that's our thermostat. So she makes all the decisions, but only the king can tell you the temperature. That's the way that we're going to reference this. You need the king to be able to tell you what's going on, but only the queen can make the choice about whether the heat should be increased or decreased. So what we're going to look at is we've just set our tank up. We want 30 degrees, but we are turning our thermostat and ramping up our temperature. And the issue that you've got is that you're going to end up with a flash point here. Your thermostat, say we need to reach 30 degrees, and over time, once the tank's set up, we work out that this sensor only needs to be set at 25.8 degrees to reach 30 degrees on the log. We don't know that initially. So we're going to make a guess, 25, 26 degrees. Until that sensor reaches its set point, it will keep heat going into the tank. So what is going to happen to our reading? It's going to go up. And it's going to go far higher initially than we want it to. Which means that you could end up with readings as high as 40 or even 50 degrees Celsius until your stat reaches its set point. The only thing that controls the heat in the tank is the thermostat. And by turning the dial or changing your digital readout, you are making a set point. And until that sensor reaches the value you have set pointed, it will keep heat going in. So what we have is latency or time, and that's allowing your tank to cycle up and get up to temperature. So when we tell people to set up their thermostats initially in their Vivs, you're going to make a rough guess, 25, 26 degrees, but you are going to wait 2 hours before you even take a reading. Because if you take one before that, you're going to be panicking because it's going to read 40 or 50 degrees Celsius. And that's because the tank's still cycling up. So we're going to end up with a, let me see what fits into this screen. We're going to end up with a initial peak at the basking site whilst the stat's cycling, and then it will start to calm down and it will start to even out. And it's at this point, usually after 2.5 hours, that we can start making incremental changes, tiny changes, because every time the set point changes by too much, the stat panics, the queen. I'm not at the temperature I need to be. I've got two options: flood it with more wattage or reduce wattage. And either way, we're going to end up with another peak or a trough. If we make too big a change, we start trying to chase the tail of a dragon at the basking site, trying to get it to balance out to 30 degrees. So my advice is tiny, notch-like increments. And each increment is going to be a 20-minute gap. So this is why it takes patience and time. And usually when you buy an adult corn rig or an adult beardy rig, certainly from Snakes and Adders, we want you to take at least 48 hours to get your tank balanced out. We've got a 2.5 hour lead time to ramp up, get that peak, the big peak, out of the way. And then you're going to start making slow changes, either turning up or slightly turning down, until we reach the value that we require. Now, true stability in a vivarium is difficult to achieve, simply because we have vents and their job is to exchange air. Heat rises, we know that through physics, so your hot air gets exhausted, cool air gets dragged in. That affects temperature, but we need that because we need the convection of the tank where all the hot air is coming out and the cool air is coming in, so that we get a air cycle that keeps the air fresh, and it doesn't allow massive pathogen build-up because it's stagnant air that's just allowed to warm up. This means that when you position your Viv, you also need a gap of probably at least 3 to 6 inches from a wall. And that's another thing. We're going to go through positioning within the home as well, which is another issue. So you've now set up your tank. You're happy that we're holding at 30 degrees. Bish bash bosh. Now, that could be a bearded dragon, and that would change to 42 to 45 degrees. And the process is identical, except your peaks in that situation could be as high as 60 degrees initially, waiting for that first peak to get over because you're running at so much a higher temperature. Now, the positioning in the home, the environment in which you place your vivarium will affect the way that this works. We've had people that have simply struggled like hell to get their temperatures to balance properly, and that's because they've sat this in a bay window and then can't work out why it's not working properly, because there's a bloody great draft coming through your vents. Equally, an external wall is going to be running cooler than an internal wall that leads to another room within the home. Conversely, we don't want something that affects the temperature the other way. People will sit these in front of a radiator and then wonder why the gradient's off. Then also we'll put it in a conservatory, whether it's either roasting or freezing. Or if it's in a south facing room, they'll have it where the sun directly enters the tank. And then obviously the greenhouse effect, it overheats. So as much as this is part of the setup, common sense about vivarium placement within your home is equally important as well. So Temperature guns, that's another thing that I mentioned that we were going to go to, and people like to use them, like to buy them. They reflect a surface heat, not the air heat. This is going to give you the air, and generally speaking, I work with air, and that's what I want it to be. If you think even just on a reasonable day in England, 24 degrees, that's hot for us. Certainly up north, I'd be investing shorts and flip-flops in 24 degrees. But it's not hot by any stretch of the imagination. But if I was to take my digital temperature gun and fire it at the concrete or the stone outside, that would read 50. So what are we reading? So generally I prefer using the air temperatures. And if you're going to use a gun, setting a gun temperature to 30 degrees, you may find that the air temperature is only 27, 26. Could be even cooler. So it's just something for you to think about. Maybe use both, and then you can compare and contrast. The guns confuse me a little bit, so I prefer using sensors. And if you want to be really accurate, you can use a chef's food thermometer with sensor, with a probe. And then it's going to pick up the air and it's going to be accurate because it's properly calibrated. But that's down to you. There's plenty of solutions on the market, and again, this is about trying to keep it simple, not overcomplicate it. And more than likely, if you're a novice, you're walking in and you can buy the equipment that's readily available to you within a store, and there are digital thermometers on the market that are going to do a perfectly serviceable job for you. And you know, all of this other equipment, whether it's thermostats, spot bulbs, or whatever else. Equally, we also know, just as a side note, we now recommend, this was for a corn snake, and I mean, even if it was for a beardie or whatever else, snakes now in their adult enclosures, certainly at Snakes and Adders, they leave with a UV kit, and the UV kit should be paired with your heater to provide a lit end and a dark end. So not only is there a thermal gradient, there is a photo gradient that runs roughly the same. So we've got light and dark, and then what we would ideally do is provide security along the entirety of the length of our enclosure, so that your animal does not need to choose between security and the temperature it wishes to be. And this is a psychological thing. This is so it can settle in. If these two hides weren't there, a snake invariably would sit underneath that cave and dehydrate rather than risk coming down for a drink, certainly when it's first introduced to a novel enclosure, because it doesn't feel safe. Whereas when it's got the option to hide itself away and be outside of the line of sight across the thermal range, it will then use these hides to find its Goldilocks temperature, depending on what it might be, and it's going to move between the ends. Day-night thermostats. So that was something else that we were going to discuss. I realise this is looking very scribbly now, so I do apologise for that, but there's a fair bit to fit in, and hopefully you're finding it useful. Day-night thermostats. This is where we've got a set point for day, a set point for night. So say, as we said down here, we've got a, say, 30 degree day, and we're going to drop to a 26 degree night, and then we're going to return to a 30 degree day. The thermostats are only good at reading their own sensor, and if the sensor isn't at the set point that's required, as we've mentioned earlier, it will keep the wattage going in until it reads the value. This means that there's a latency to reaction, which means invariably thermostats will overshoot. So if you're going to take temperature readings, you're not going to worry about the readings until at least an hour after set point change, because we may drop off and drop below, and when we return we may overshoot. And if during those hour blocks you take a reading, you panic and you think that it's not doing its job, but they're a blip and they soon return to normal values. But that's just because the stat sensor isn't quite where it needs to be, and your reading from here, the basking site, the king, and the king will display real time, whereas the stat's still playing catch up, and it takes usually about an hour and a half for it to fully catch up, which is why you may end up with these blips or troughs throughout the day. Then The other thing that we can discuss is probably worth mentioning. There's different kinds of heaters on the market. That would be spotlights, so tungsten filament spotlights, halogen spotlights, deep heat projectors, and ceramics. I'm not going to go into the science, the IRA, B and C and all that crap. It's more about the action on the Vivarium. A spotlight is directional and a halogen is directional. This is great for setting up either more temperate or desertscape environments, simply because we can get a really very intense heat here and the tank's going to cool down. So that would mimic the ranges that we'd normally commonplace keep, say, a beardy at, with 42 to 45 at the hotspot and a cool end running 25, 26 degrees. But then if we've got, say, a Brazilian rainbow boa or a red-tailed racer, you are talking about tropical, equatorial, rainforest animals, white-lipped python, something like that, where the gradient's far more shallow. So actually, the distribution of heat, we kind of want to be less efficient because we want the gradient to be shallower. So that's where kind of ceramics come in. And as much as people abhor them and slag them off, and you go on certain groups and they've got nothing nice to say about them, I still find them really useful, certainly for tropical animals. And that's because that inefficiency and blowing heat everywhere, we're still going to end up with a hotspot just because positionally it's at one end. So this will be the heated end, but the heat radiates out all over. That means that this cool end becomes warmer than it would be with a directional heater, which means that I can then have a gradient from, say, 33 to 27 rather than 45 to 26. And it means that shallower gradient is more in keeping with a rainforest scape. And again, this is for beginners. So we're not going to be trying to sell you a 3-heater solution for a single Viv. We're going to try and do it as simply as we can so that you can understand it. I know there are people out there that use multiple heaters. I know you exist. I'm not ignoring you. It's just this is for novices. So this is why we're doing it this way. What I just alluded to was people might then pair or stage heaters down the Vivarium, and they'll either run it off the same stat but a lesser wattage bulb, so it's a stage decline, or they'll run a second thermostat. That becomes expensive quick. So, you know, if we're on about trying to do this value for money, then, you know, that's where ceramics come in, and they really help with giving a more even heat distribution within the Viv. But ceramics are quite an aggressive heater. It's nearly all infrared C, and they do dry out the air, so you may find that you need to spray it more. So I'll give you a little nod there, because if I don't, then no doubt someone's going to pick me to pieces. But that effectively is how I set the thermostats up, why I set them up that way, and why my PO positions are where they are. And it's all in an effort to make sure that the stat sensor is secure. It's not going to allow for positional fluctuations. It's in a set place. We use the king. Now, if the snake or lizard crawls over it, knocks it off, just put it back. And the world's not going to end because the stat's not reacted to the sensor moving. And periodically, you can put it back and you can keep checking. You don't need to check every day. Once the stat's done, you're pretty much stable and set. If there's big seasonal shifts, summer, winter, it's probably worth recalibrating slightly and making sure that you're still on the right track. But for the most part, once it's done, it's done. Day-night units, don't panic the first hour and a half after the change from day to night, and only take readings from an hour and a half onwards. That means then that the spike that may occur is not panicking you, because suddenly your corn snake's reading 40 degrees for maybe 40 minutes whilst its sensor cycles up and then drops back down to 30. It won't do any harm in the short term at all. I hope that helps. I just sort of fly through these. I don't make any notes. It's just how I would discuss it in the shop. No doubt there will be little bits that maybe are slightly erroneous, but this is the cut and thrust of how I do things. Hopefully it helps. Hopefully it's made you understand it a bit more. And all the best. We'll keep these videos coming, and I'll see you soon, guys. Cheers.